Welcome to the session about harmony and biodynamic agriculture. Can you hear me at the back? Are you okay? Should I speak a little louder, maybe? Okay. So, my name is Thomas Harttung. I'm a biodynamic farmer in Denmark. Being a biodynamic farmer involves a personal search. And the search can be of a religious nature, a spiritual nature, or a social nature, biological nature, or even just a compassionate nature towards the animal world. So it comes in many forms, but you cannot be a biodynamic farmer without immersing yourself personally into this, for better words, bold conceptual framework that was set up in 1924. And the picture, the first slide here, is from the beginnings of where all of this work took place. This is the first center for the distribution of knowledge about biodynamic agriculture, amongst other things. Because Rudolf Steiner was a pioneer and a polymath, if there ever was one. So he was involved in a number of causes. Actually, Rudolf Steiner was also a pioneer of question and answer sessions. And I'm saying this to you because we want to involve you as an audience in this session. He was a pioneer of question and answers, to the point that from the sessions when this building that you see on the picture over there was built, there are 8 volumes of questions and answers from those sessions. Every morning during the coffee break that we've just had, he would sit down with the workers and have a Q&A session. So I only had room in the plane to bring 4 of these, but there are 8 of these volumes of questions and answers from those days. So we won't have time to go through all of these today, as you can well understand. I'm only joking. But we do have 4 eminent practitioners of these principles. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next 4 speakers, and the way we'll structure the session is that we'll give them a chance to portray to you their personal journey and their inspiration, and then after that we'll involve you and you'll have every opportunity to ask those questions. All of this work, this whole body of practice, which is almost 100 years old now, came actually out of a question. And Ueli, our first speaker, I think will touch on that. But it was basically this entire body of practice came because of farmers questioning their the tendencies of their day. So I'm going to hand it over now to our first speaker, is Ueli Huerter. He's a practicing farmer in Switzerland, and he's also the co-head of the agricultural section of the Goetheanum, the Steiner Center in Switzerland. So, Ueli, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Thomas, for inviting me and us here for this very exciting conference about harmony. And to introduce myself, I will just show you where I come from. It's from Switzerland, so excuse my English. I will try to give my best. And the place where I live and where I farm is called l'Aubier. It's in the French part of Switzerland, and it started more than 30 years ago with a very little biodynamic farm. And look, it became a wonderful farm. It's the farm building on the picture beneath. And then we have other activities which we run nowadays. We have a hotel, we have a restaurant, we have a shop, and we have this little eco village, which you can see on the picture. So just to show that out of a biodynamic impulse can arise a more general initiative to bring life and research and community building to the land. And the buildings you can see, they have been more or less expensive because we are in Switzerland, and the money was not in our pockets when we started as young people, and so we structured our enterprise in the sense that people can take shares and be partners with us. And so you have to imagine that the money, the capital we needed to build up this initiative came from several hundred people, which we consider as our partners, and all together we are carrying this future enterprise since more than 30 years. So it's based on biodynamics, and it's also based on a partnership approach to economics. And for me, the both are very close together, yeah? How we look in the nature, so we structure our social realities. This is an old principle we also can learn from the Prince in his Harmony book. This is the one part of my engagement, and the other one, as Thomas said, for 7 years now, I'm co-head of the agricultural department at the Goetheanum. And look to this building. It's not the same you have seen on the picture before, because the one you have seen on the picture before, the first Goetheanum, it refers to the German poet Goethe. It has burned down. It doesn't exist anymore. It was out of wood. And then, at the end of his life, Rudolf Steiner sculptured a model of the second one. And here you see the second one. And it expresses the same impulse, but in another shape, in another form. And look to it, it's harmony, but in some way it's going further than harmony. It's some kind, perhaps we can call it evolving harmony. And therein you see we have arts, we have science, we have research, we have networking, and on the middle picture in the big hall, each February we have a big international biodynamic conference, and the last one this year in February has been of the topic of soil, and we achieved together with Patrick Holden to have a video message from Prince Charles to our conference. So we have been very lucky to have this. And now it's my task to try to introduce you to what is biodynamics, and I call it the 7 principles of biodynamic agriculture. They are not official principles. They have not been approved by an international body, or they are not directly from Steiner. I felt that it could be helpful that we have something like this, which is, as the Prince did in his Harmony book, yeah, to try to look to this level where things can be described in a principal way. So it's not the very core essence of something, but it's not how it appears really in the sensual world, but let's try to describe what the biodynamic impulse, what the biodynamic agriculture is in these 7 principles, but it's a free way to do it. It's not an official way. And I go through them now, one after the other one, and you see that I did this little drawing by side. We go from a more general view of the soil, then to the plants, then to the animals, and then we come to some kind of crossing point. What will happen there? And then it goes, this is more the natural realm we are taking in account for our work, and then more and more it works out in the social reality around the farm and in society. And I tried to make very simple drawings to imagine what I would try to say. So not to have photos, not to have computer designed pictures, but handmade little drawings. And the first of the principle is that the soil we consider as the respiratory organ, as the breathing organ of the earth. And that means that when you look to the drawing, we have this reality of, let's say, heaven with light and warmth above. And we have the reality, a complete other phenomenological reality, which is linked to the earth, with the moisture, with the minerals. And soil will mean that the two interpenetrate, and it's our task as farmers, as agriculturists, to manage this kind of interpenetration, and in a sense that it can really breathe, that the soil is not just a cutting off of the two spheres of heaven and earth, but they can encounter and then give life and production. And this is imagined with this line which has waves, and it means that this breathing is going on in a daily rhythm, in a rhythm which is linked to the year and so on. And we also speak about the soil as the diaphragm of the organism, of the overall organism we are working with. So this is the horizontal dimension, the principle of the horizontal dimension with a dynamic breathing. The second one is that let's look to the plants, and the plants, when you look how they grow in this verticality, yes, this comes to a cross with the horizontality of the soil. And the principle of the plants is to be in this verticality. And of course, this relates to our verticality. And you see that the plant is the one being who lives in the light sphere and in the dark sphere, and makes this link really a living one. And each plant points with the flower to the sun, and with the top of the root to the center of the earth. It's really this line which shows up with each plant. And now imagine the globe, the round globe. So it radiates from the center of the earth to the surrounding of the earth, of the globe earth. This is what the plants are about, but on each particular place, it's this vertical dimension. And when we are breeders of plant, for example, we really try to work concretely with this vertical dimension. It's very important that this can be expressed according to the different species of plant, for to have the nutrition we have. And now we go a step further and we introduce the animals. And with the animals, and here you can see a lovely Swiss cow, I hope you can see it, with the horns. And you see most of the vegetables, of the plants which are growing on the farm goes through the stomach of the cows, and we have the manure, and the manure makes a new loop in the soil and only then goes again to the roots of the plants. So we close our farm organism with introducing the animals, and therefore then we speak about the farm organism. So it's not about the system, it's not about a mechanical box where things are happening in. It's really considered from our side the farm as a living organism as a whole. And this we can achieve when we introduce the ruminants and when we can close the cycles, the cycles of the substances. And coming to this point, in experience, but also when Steiner presents this to the farmers of his time, then we can see, and he came to the conclusion out of his research, this cannot be the end. This is the very, let's say, nice, traditional, harmonial way to farm. But can this be sustainable for the future? And the answer from us, as the biodynamic movement, is no. We have to go one step further, and we have to open up now this closed organism, this living organism, to a new, let's say, cosmic dimension. And look, the circle now in the next picture, you find it in a little way, and you see that with the preparations, we open up and we re-enter in communication. Now, not on a physical input-output level, but in a spiritual, cosmic level with the forces, cosmic and earthly forces. And these preparations are perhaps the most specific things we have in our agriculture. And just to show how concrete, how practical, but how principled they are, here is one of them, the horn manure, where we put manure in horns. We dig them in the soil. In winter time, you see, we work with the rhythms. Then we steer it for 1 hour and we bring it out to and live in the soil. We have the horn silica. It's the complementary one, where it's some kind of concentration of light, which is in the crystal. We make a powder out of it, and we stir it in the morning after it has been digging in the earth between summer, and we bring it out of the green plants that they can relink with the light forces. And then we have the 6 compost preparations where we try to build in our compost and manure heaps new faculties, let's say, for this farm individuality. We go further with the preparations from the farm organism to build the farm individuality, and this is a term, this is an expression, a principle which is not natural, which is cultural, which comes from the man's world, from us as human beings. So the model, the underlined model for the biodynamic agriculture is more man, the human being, than nature without human being. And now I go to the 5th principle. Once we have done like this, it can then, this place where we do this, can become a place where it can give forces to the surrounding, first to the landscape. So the climate or the water issue we already addressed in this conference, but also that the landscape is nice and is for us, for the mans, and the birds, the insects, forests, and so on. So that a place, a biodynamic place, a biodynamic farm is not somewhere where nature is damaged, but the opposite, where nature can become new forces. And this is a productive way to farm, so food can go out, and then money, or let's say acknowledgement, and what is around in the social reality of our world can come back to the farm. And we know all that this is a weak point in our overall organic and biodynamic food reality at the moment, that there is not enough, let's say, money or other recognition and acknowledgement which is coming back to our places. And the seventh of the principle, that in my observation, I have often seen that when we work like this in a real agricultural way with the land, with the plants, with the animals, then we can also bring health and insights and new forms to the social reality. And I put here the liberté, égalité, fraternité, the three ideals of the France Revolution. And in some way, these places, these biodynamic places, they can become wellsprings, or let's say future labs of what we are looking to for our social future. And in this way, perhaps we can say that the human being as the foundation and the spiritual impulses for the paradigm change in food and agriculture. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to very much go from my practical experience and just share a little bit in the few minutes I have. We'll have to see. So I started farming in my teens, my early teens. I just loved farming. But by the time I was 18, I'd heard about biodynamics, and I kind of felt, I suppose in my heart or just intuitively, that was the way to go. And I had a very lucky experience when I was 21, because I had the possibility to go to South Africa, down to near Cape Town on a farm 50 kilometers north of Cape Town to sort of take over the farm. Rather naive, I wasn't very experienced, but that was the situation. But what did I meet there? I don't know if you can see that, but it was just sand. It's pure sand, and that's me in the trench down there, which just shows that it's just like beach sand. And that's quite challenging for a biodynamic farm. I don't know if you think why that would be challenging for a biodynamic farm. But it's what I want to dwell on, really, because it's what sort of been my journey, is this whole question of soil fertility. Because on a biodynamic farm, as we've heard, we sort of work with this concept that the farm is, well, a farm organism or a farm individuality, that it's actually, the farm's got a boundary, and when you talk about an organism, that means it's got organs in it, which can be the soil, it can be the rivers, or the ponds, the different crops, and so on. And so as a farmer, one's a bit like an artist or a conductor or whatever, and one has to try and make this all work. But the primary thing is that we don't want to have to bring in fertility from off the farm, and we don't want to have to bring animal feeds in. So that creates a real challenge, because how do you do that? Because that's true sustainable farming, of course, and there's farms that have been doing that the last 90 years. So when I went here, I had that challenge, and I was there for 15 years trying to do that, and it evolved in a certain way, and I'm not going to go into the details of that now, but I'll stay on the same theme, because my wife and I then, after 15 years, decided to move back to the Northern Hemisphere with the intention to come to the UK, but we ended up in Germany for 3 years first on a biodynamic farm. And I just want to mention that that was because I wasn't just inspired by the biodynamics, but I was very inspired by some of the early pioneers of what we call CSAs, or community-supported agriculture, and a gentleman, Manfred Klett in particular. And I saw some farms in Germany, you know, with this issue, which we all know, that it's not just the farmers who are responsible for the land, but it's actually all of us, because we all eat food that comes from the land, and where, you know, the food that we're eating, how is that being cared for? Is that land being cared for? Is it being exploited? Most of us don't know. And so with this form of agriculture, one can actually give the choice to individuals, to people, to become partners or to become co-responsible with us farmers. So when I went to Tablehurst, that was very much the intention. So Tablehurst is a farm in Sussex. It's about 600 acres, and it's a community farm, so we have a lot of community involvement. And what it's about really is that, again, I had the second chance to work on this, on creating this farm organism that is specific to that place, because every farm is where it is in the world. You can't change that. It's got its microclimate, it's got its level above sea, it's got the geology. And of course, this was completely different to what I was farming in South Africa. And one of the things was that there felt like there was a lack of water there. So you can see that right at the beginning, we created a couple of reservoirs or dams for irrigation, but for much more than that, it just felt right within the landscape. Now, I'm just going to go through these very quickly, just to give you an idea of some of the different enterprises or dimensions of the farm, because it became very diversified. These are crops from this year. Of course, I've chosen the better looking crops. We have our disasters as well. And that's part of what it's all about. We're very much on this learning curve. That's a little deer we saw the other morning at the beans. And that's some of the farm team. We're about, I think we're 25 employed people, plus some apprentices and 3 people with learning disabilities. And the neighboring farm of the same size has got 1 person. It sort of stands out quite strongly. But what I want to come to is a bit more of the biodynamics. And on all biodynamic farms, the processing of the manures and the organic matter is a very important part, as you will realize from the fact that we have specific compost preparations, herbal preparations we put in the heaps. And but what I'd like to share is what Steiner used when he spoke to the farmers back in 1924. It really strikes a chord with me, and that is he uses the analogy of the compass. And why does the compass needle point north? And of course, we all know, and they knew then, that you don't get your microscopes out and look inside the needle as to why it points north. It's only when you know there's a force field around the Earth, the magnetic force field, that makes the needle point north. And he said, if you're looking at a beetroot or some other plant, it's no good just getting your microscope out and looking at the smaller and smaller parts within it. I mean, the DNA and everything wasn't known then in that way, 100 years ago. But that you actually have to look even beyond the Earth, but to the whole cosmos. And of course, we all know that it's actually the sun that generates our whole agriculture through the photosynthesis, but we easily forget that somehow, ironically, and that sun creates the seasons, but then we've got the other planets working, and we've actually got the zodiac, And the forces that stream in from the cosmos from the different directions of the zodiac all have their part to play in creating this harmony of what nature is and creating what we have to work with. And as a biodynamic farmers, we're trying to grasp these things and work with these elements as well. That's where we store our preparations. What I wanted to also share is that I, as a farmer farming in this country, I get very enthusiastic and excited about where farming is right now, because it's changed in the last 5 years. And there's 4 different things I'd like to share where gets me enthusiastic. And I mean, I've just been a couple of weeks ago at an event called Groundswell, which is really about no-till, and it's about mainly conventional farmers who are attending that because maybe they're attending it because they think they can cut the costs, but it's about the soil. And there's fantastic speakers there. There's Joe Williams, there's Christine Jones from Australia, they had other people from America there talking about soil and soil life. And so I think it's great how farmers are picking that up. But even more important for me is this whole area of mixed cover crops, of growing green manure as cover crops, but multi-species cover crops. And that's something we're working with very much. And it's come up Graham Harvey mentioned it in the previous session, that actually it is the sun that is generating the photosynthesis, generating the sugars in the plant, but the plant is not just keeping it for itself. They are putting a lot of these sugars into the soil as these root exudates. And that is feeding the bacteria and the fungi and this whole soil life. And that each plant puts out a different sugar solution, you're creating this web of mycorrhiza, and that when you grow different crops together, it creates this underground network where they support each other and the yields are much higher. And so, put that into simple words, it's actually the plants that are creating the soil and soil fertility. And for most conventional farmers, that's completely balmy because we think in terms of NPK and inputs and outputs. But actually, it's a self-contained thing, and that's what we're trying to work with. The other new thing, which we're trying at Tablehurst, is the mob grazing. This is some of our cows just being moved into the next patch. We're moving them on a daily basis. There they are with their heads down. And that is also just a method, using the animals as a tool to more efficiently build up the organic matter in your soil. And the other group I want to mention, which is everybody here knows, is the Pasture for Life organization. And there, I find it very gratifying because you've got the whole spectrum of farmers there, but they've all grasped the significance of the fact that the cow is a herbivore and should not be fed concentrates and grains, but is designed and should be eating forage. And that and it goes much further than that because the science is now catching up and showing that the meat and the milk and the produce from animals fed in that way is different to animals fed on concentrates and the polluting way. So what I'm feeling is that there's a groundswell change within farming that we don't know where it's going to go because you've got this terrible industrialized agriculture on the one side, but you've got these signs of promise that I see on the other. And with the biodynamics, it's all based on good agricultural practice, but then just adding these other things. So these 2 sprays that Ueli mentioned, you know, with the one based with the cow manure, the other with the silica, we spray our whole farm with that. And the one is really, the one with the cow manure is about this humus formation in the soil that I've been talking about and that all these methods are pointing to, and that is to help intensify that process. And the other one with the silica is about the keeping quality of the produce. is about the ripening process, creating balance there, and it's what makes the biodynamic wine taste so good, because people are going for the taste there, whereas they don't taste the carrots necessarily in the same way. And I have to stop in a minute. I just wanted to finish off with the bees at the end, because the bees I see as terribly important in nature, and it's not just about the pollination. They have a much, much bigger significance than that. In a way, they're the canary in the mine. They're showing how bad our agriculture has got, because the bees worldwide are in such a bad state. And that has to do with the farming on the one side, because the bees are managing not too badly in the cities. It's in the countryside, where through the herbicides and that, they haven't, they're on starvation diet until they come to a rape field for a few weeks, and then it's back to starvation diet. But it's also the beekeepers, keeping the bees in a way that they shouldn't be kept, where the integrity of the bee is not respected. I can talk a long time about this, so I have to stop. But just as a last thing, Steiner talked about the poison of the bee. Now, we get stung, but actually this poison is necessary within nature, and that when a bee visits a flower in its excitement, it does release some of this poison, and that has actually got a significance we're not really aware of, and I can't even explain. But I think as people, many of us have this relationship to the bee, a kind of intuitive relationship to know their importance, and that they're tied up with love and many other aspects. So as farmers, we should keep the bee within this farm organism with all the different parts of it as an important part. Anyway, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing that very personal journey from the UK to South Africa to Germany and back to the UK. Our next speaker is Alex Valsecchi. She also has a past on the Southern Hemisphere, but her journey went from Italy to New Zealand to the UK, and she's now the vineyard manager at the Albury vineyard in Surrey, and she's going to tell her about her journey. So over to you, Alex.
Hello, everybody. Right, I'm a novice in this field of biodynamic. I'm an infant. Perhaps not an infant in growing. I've been in horticulture for about over 25 years. But despite the fact that I'm an infant in this field, for once I almost feel at home. Perhaps it's because I'm not the only one with a dodgy accent around. Anyway, let's see what we can do to keep you awake. So I took my doctorate in fruit culture and viticulture at University of Milan in 1996. And that was pure science applied and pure chemistry. And I would say that 25 years ago, probably not many people even knew the meaning of the word organic. I still believe that not many people know the meaning of the word organic nowadays, but that was the days. After taking my doctorate and have had practice in vineyards in Italy, I came to England and I worked at the Royal Horticultural Society for 10 years as responsible of the fruit department there. And I started to understand a little bit more about organic and organic principle. Whilst I was at the RHS, I had the chance to travel to New Zealand. I went there several years on a trot and be more exposed to what organic meant and what you can do when you actually work with nature. And finally, I landed back in UK and I met this chap that had this mad idea of planting a vineyard in England and make it a viable business. And when he said to me, I want to be biodynamic, I then passed over. But as you can see, I recovered reasonably okay. So taking you through this journey, what that picture just says, conventional growing is very much a systematic approach. And there's nothing more systematic about looking at this vineyard and straight rows. If you go down any alley or any supermarket, it recalls very much a row of cans and beans, doesn't it? What is organic about that? Probably just the fact that we work with organic materials. At the end of the day, plants is an organic material, but it is very much a monoculture. Well, perhaps you find there is a little bit of grass growing in between the vines, but that's very much it, really. But that is what is viticulture in the greatest part of the world, is conventional viticulture, is there for cropping, is there to producing the greatest yield and flood us with wine. Greater part of my study and my practice whilst at university were done in a little bit more of adverse condition. Were done in the north of Italy, just above Milan really, in a stretch of land called Valtellina, which is just south of the Alps. Growing conditions there are tough, and it shows from this picture really. Mankind has been terracing this land and grow vines where probably not mankind would want to go really. And in order to help mankind to achieve and be successful with the business, on top of the adverse extreme weather condition that these valleys can give you, is really rely on the use of chemical as much as they can really in order to achieve this yield. The kind of wine that I produce in this area, they're mainly full-bodied red wines, and the variety is actually very similar to Nebbiolo. If you know about your wine, Nebbiolo is the grape that goes in Barolo, one of the classic Italian reds. And this is a clone of Nebbiolo called Chiavennasca, simply because the town nearby is Chiavenna. But the wine names is what perhaps brings you down to what conventional viticulture mean in this part of the world. We have wine there that they called grumello, grums, crumbs, sassella from sasso, stones, sforzato, something that is forced, that is pushed. To the top of it, inferno, hell, okay? What is harmonic about these names? Perhaps nothing. What is harmonic about the wine? Some of these are excellent wines, but still, in pronouncing this name, it doesn't bring you close to harmony. Moving on, I leave Italy and I come to England, and many people said to me, what the hell did you do, leaving Lake Como and going to UK and plant vines there, where the climate is not even suitable to human being, no matter the less to vines? Well, I like the challenge, and you'll probably find out that quite easily when you talk to me. I like the challenge of growing a crop, and if you can grow a crop in an adverse climatic condition, then you can probably grow it everywhere. Wisley, the RHS, is probably the triumph of education, conservation, and innovation. They've been going on for hundreds of years. They've taught many of UK and international students how to deal with growing. And I was there as a fruit expert, and that is where we came closer to organic and organic principle. How can we grow organic? Well, let's put it this way. Perhaps if we can give us a bit of help, starting off with disease-resistant variety, then we will have to do a bit less to these plants, especially to fight diseases like the mildews, the botrytis. They're always there where climate is particularly characterized by, looking out there, humidity. And also try to work with integrate pest management, so induce more of a natural fauna that can fight off, pests. So try to bring in, by using meadows and cover crops, any kind of biological control that is already there, parasitic wasps, and so on. And this is a way, perhaps, that is easier and helps you to grow organically. Whilst at Wisley, I went off to New Zealand, and I think New Zealand is the paradise for growing. I don't know if many of you had the luck to go there, but it is the land for growing, simply because, A, you got over 2,000 hours of sun per year, which is fantastic. is volcanic land, so naturally is particularly rich in minerals, and nevertheless plants do need minerals to thrive, like we do need them to live. And there I really see the harmony in between plants, animal, and humans. This vineyard is Serezin, and the name itself recalls serenity. So you can see where I'm getting to. Serezin is one of the pioneers in organic viticulture in New Zealand. They're based in Marlborough, so the tip part of the South Island. And they worked a lot with green manures there. You can see some of the reminiscence in between these vines. And already you can see by looking at this picture the greatest difference from the first slides I show you. We're not anymore amongst shelves in a supermarket, we are amongst plants. And with the plants, they introduce animals. So they have sheep there that they graze under the vines, and they keep perhaps some of the vegetation down to reduce the level of moisture around the vines. And what sheep do, they do their business. They go an entire vineyard to do so, and therefore they add natural fertilizers to the vines. With that in mind, coming back to England, I said, okay, I should do something. I'm approaching 40. I could have stayed with the RHS and perhaps, enjoyed my retirement there. But I needed to do something different, and I came across Nick Wemman, whose past was in software, so nothing to do with harmony there. And he wanted to plant this vineyard, but he didn't know anything about viticulture. He needed a vineyard manager. We met, we liked each other, and we say, okay, let's do it. So we planted Albury just by Albury village. It's on the Surrey Hills, about 6 miles north of Guildford. So we are in la crème de la crème of consumism, really. Surrey, come on, yeah? And probably I look like a Surrey lady by now. It's called Adaptation. Yeah. And there are definitely challenges in growing vines in UK. Some of them I've already mentioned them. The extreme weather, the rain is always there. Sometimes we get some snow. But what was most of all is spring frost, and especially this year, most of the viticulture of UK is being hammered, and we probably overall lost 50% of the potential cropping because of the frost last April. Weeds control in organic farming, biodynamic farming, is very difficult. And you say, what is a weed? Well, a weed is perhaps a plant that you don't want or in the wrong place. We have learned to live with weeds because they're not weeds at the end of the day. They are plants, and they are plants that can perhaps will attract some beneficial insect, not just to the vine, but generally to the whole of the microclimate that you try to create. And at the end is pests and diseases, and it's a big point, and it's still a challenge to me try to overcome these problems biodynamically. But we seem to have let nature doing its course, and that's what this journey is about, and that's what the step to harmony is about, to really let nature do its own thing. Because before we came on site, the planet was functioning perfectly fine. Then we arrived and we made a bloody mess out of it. And now we're trying to bring it back to its original status. And that's what we've done. If you look at the vineyard, yes, we still grow these things in rows, because at the end of the day, we're wearing a farmer hat. It has to be practical for us to access the fruit, to harvest the fruit. But we let everything else do its own thing. The picture with the poppy was when we just planted the vineyard, and you probably know better than I do that poppy seeds can last in the ground for over 20 years. We cultivated the ground prior planting, and the next spring, all this poppy came up. And it was quite an impressive scene. We had people stopping along the road and coming up to see what the hell that was, They said, being slaughtered some pigs or cows. I said, no, it's just poppies. I said, oh, did you sow all of them? No, they just came up naturally. I said, naturally, yes. That's a weird word, is it? And what we have achieved by working with nature and applying the biodynamic principle is letting everything else thrive amongst the vines, or better, the vines are thriving amongst everything else. And when people come, we do tour and taste all the time because it's the way to bring money in, let's face it, okay? So we do this tour and tasting, and people come to me and they say, what is biodynamic? And I say, well, how can I put it? It's probably homeopathic remedy with plants for plants. A little, but often. Take it in a bit at a time, and I say, okay, what do you use? What plants do you use? Well, if you look underneath these vines, you can see we got Achilles growing there, yarrow. We got nettles growing. They're good for nitrogen. We make nettles tea out of them. We got comfrey, very good for potassium. We make tea out of comfrey to feed our vines with. And all these different flora just does what we need for the vines to thrive, brings in a hell of a lot of good buddies, microorganisms, not just at root level to help the vines to absorb the very little nutrient that perhaps a soil, like a chalky soil, like is the one of the cereals, might give you, but also brings in all the beneficial at the top. When we talked about disease, fighting disease and fighting pest, more than fight them is try to work with them. And by bringing in naturally all these other plants, we bring in good fungi, good bacteria, good insects that they colonize the leaf plant area, and then there's no room for the bad buddies to get there. And this is how we try to achieve it. At the end of the day, we're aiming to get to harmony. Perhaps we're not there yet, but I think this summarizes it all, and I just show you that that is not just a fake. There it is. So we're going from hell, inferno, to Serezin, to silent pool. And there's nothing more harmonious than having spring water filling up a pond and call it silent pool. So there's harmony in a bottle for you. Thank you very much.
Our last presenter is Ed Berger. He's going to speak about the agricultural entity in a more educational perspective. So we will be talking about a product which is not a physical product that just flows, but is about fellow human beings primarily. So I'm going to hand it over to Edna.
Good morning. So I farm in the West Midlands, about 15 miles southwest of Birmingham. And I run a very small farm. It's 32 acres. We farm on a very, very light soil. It's a soil that you can pick up and run through your fingers. We have a micro dairy where we milk goats. And we have beef cattle, laying hens, and we grow about 1.5 acres of vegetables, much of which supplies the college. We work with young people who have social and learning difficulties. Many of them are on the autistic spectrum. Some of them come with challenging behavior, trauma from early life, and mental health problems increasingly. So when I was putting this talk together, I was kind of thinking a bit about what's my thread through it all. I think like many people who come into agriculture, into kind of alternative agriculture particularly, there's a sense of disharmony that kind of takes you to that. And I've had several threads in my life. I trained as an artist, first of all, and then as a farmer, and then as a teacher. And those things have kind of come together for me. So I was kind of thinking, well, what is it that in my 40s I've begun to think about? What's the thread in that? In your 20s, you kind of get a lot of stuff that comes to you by grace. I mean, in your 30s, often you just kind of work your butt off. And then in your 40s, there's a sort of question about, well, kind of what was all that then, and kind of where am I now? So I've been thinking a lot recently about what my thread is, and I think what I'm really interested in all of these different threads of art and farming and teaching is what are the conditions? What are the conditions behind things? So I'm going to talk about that today. And I suppose my starting point for conditions in my own life is that I have a stammer, and I've stammered my whole life, and kind of less so now as an adult. But in a way, as a stammerer, you're very aware of your kind of inner world, because whenever you go to speak to people, there's a kind of inner negotiation. Oh my God, am I going to have to say my name? Am I going to have to kind of say certain words that are going to be difficult? And so there's this kind of reflection between the inner process and the outer manifestation that comes out on the other side when you speak. And so that's kind of led me towards this kind of question about conditions. And the other thing that has really informed my work has been drawing. And drawing, in a way, has been a place where I could rest in my work. I live on the farm. I have my family on the farm, and I have lots of kids who come to the farm every day. I'm also the deputy principal of the college, so there's a lot of other stuff going on there. And drawing is a place where I feel that I can kind of get information, really, about the farm and about myself. So it's a place to kind of hang my attention. And I found this wonderful quote by William James. It says, "Consciousness is a perch and a flight. It needs a perch from which to rest and take off." And so for me, drawing is kind of the perch, and the rest of the time I'm flying. So that's been very helpful. And I've just put a few drawings in to go along, just to kind of show this a kind of part of my process, really, with farming. So I'm really interested in, as I say, conditions. And the root of the word condition is to be with the showing of something, to be with the manifestation of something. And to really be with something is a kind of state of profound empathy. And in a way, that feels like a lot of the work is to come to this kind of state of empathy, whether it's with the animal, the person, the soil, whatever that is. And that's kind of the core of my work, I feel, really, is to sort of try to develop it in myself, however lacking in rigor and how many times I fail at that, as we all do. But I feel that that's, this is just switched off. Has that come back on again? Oh, there we go. So yeah, this is a picture of the farm. And we, as I say, we have cattle, goats, we grow vegetables, and we have about 30 students who come to the farm. It's part of Ruskin Mill Trust. Ruskin Mill Trust has about 6 centres throughout the country, and one of the wonderful things about it, so we have a land and crafts-based curriculum, and it's really been a sort of laboratory for the last 30 years to find out what can the farm offer to the human, what can craft work offer in terms of development, what's the inherent learning in all these different skills that people can take out, not so much vocational skills, but life skills. So we know that in a way, as a farmer, you work with your own interests really often, and alongside that you have a level of necessity as well. And often what starts as your interest then becomes necessity after a while. So for my interest, or what I've been working with, the kind of palette of things I've been working with over the last 3 years or so has been autism primarily, and then goats and docks. These have been my sort of 3 questions: autism, goats, and docks. Obviously there's other things as well there, but you kind of have to kind of narrow down onto something. So to start off, I'm going to talk about autism. So the classical understanding of autism is that it's a social dysfunction. But more recently, researchers find or describe it as also a disorder of the senses. So it's a kind of diminished ability to separate out foreground and background stimuli. So if you imagine last night being in that, in the wonderful dinner we had, and actually, we were trying to have conversations, but at the same time we had all that conversation going on around us. We had wine glasses clinking away and people cooking, and there was a huge amount of noise. And the fact that you could actually stand there and have a conversation, more or less, was because you're able to actually separate out the information around you. So for autistic people in differing degrees, and I think kind of autism, that's why it's called an autistic spectrum, it's because it's in different levels, but there's this kind of inability to sieve out information, the information and the stimuli around you. And that's sometimes known as holistic perception or Gestalt perception. Now, the kind of amazing thing about Gestalt perception is you do receive a whole picture. And this guy, Stephen Wiltshire, some of you may be familiar with him, is an amazing autistic savant. His skill is to be able to see out over a city or over a town, retain all that information, and then come back and draw it. So these days, I think he's pretty wealthy, I can imagine, because he goes around the world, he gets flown up in a helicopter, he takes in the whole cityscape, and then he comes back to a gallery, and he has a huge piece of paper, probably the size of this wall here, and he puts his headphones in, and he sits down, and he doesn't plan the drawing. He sits down on one corner, he starts with one corner, and just kind of works his way across with a little fine liner pen. So to be able to retain that is an incredible skill, but the kind of weakness of it is overload. But he has to close down his kind of perceptual field to be able to do that. So autistic people often describe feeling kind of drowned in a background of noise, and it can result in a lot of stress, a lot of frustration for them, a lot of feeling of overwhelm. So my question has been, a lot of my work has really been about kind of how do I bring people who live in this sort of state onto a farm, and how do I give them entry points into working with animals in the kind of with the kind of understanding that working with animals has some kind of benefit, but I wanted to be a little bit more rigorous about finding where they finding out what they need. So I started working with goats, and goats have been have been really fantastic actually for kind of working with them. I got very interested in this idea of the Umwelt. The Umwelt is the kind of perception, is the sensory experience of the world that an animal experiences. So there's a whole kind of biological field now, kind of studying Umwelt. And what they found is that by looking at the animal's kind of physiology and sensory orientation, you can actually tell something about the way that it exists. So the goat, sorry, just to go back one, the goat is a rugged herbivore. It's extremely expanded in its head senses. It lives very much out, almost at 360 degrees, and then it has these times of coming back deeply into itself. And it has this kind of wonderful, if you ever go into the barn when the goats are ruminating, they've got this wonderful kind of gentle, warm feel about them. So we tried out different things. We tried to work with cattle, which had certain things. This was a pair of oxen that we trained. Unfortunately, when the oxen got to about 2, their natural sense of hierarchy kind of kicked in, and they started to really overwhelm some of our less kind of centered students. They could feel that. So we've worked with goats, and one of the things I wanted to say about goats is kind of what they offer to the young person. So I think for the really kind of introverted type, the goats offer this kind of engagement in sort of relating. So you can brush them, they can just go in and have a bit of goat time. They come out and they're inquisitive. They're not like a sheep. We tried to work with sheep, but sheep are incredibly flighty and nervous. And it ended up in situations where we were kind of having to herd students to herd the sheep. So and the goat sort of really calls, really asks for the introverted autistic person. The goat really asks them to kind of step out of themselves. And for the more extroverted type, for kind of ADHD students and this kind of thing, the student has to come in touch with their own sense of authority. So herding goats is quite interesting because they don't really herd, they kind of coalesce, and you have to kind of really be on them, and they're always interested in, they're browsers rather than grazers, so they're always interested in everything. So you have to kind of really be kind of very awake to be with them. Docks, I haven't got very much time to talk about docks, but the conditions of docks. So one of the problems on the farm that's arisen over the last couple of years is docks. We're on this very, very light soil, and the dock was really where, in areas where we've turned soil up, areas where we've had pigs, where it's broken down, the very fine, the very kind of tenuous layer of topsoil that you get on the sand, you get a very mineralized condition. And I went really into the book by Charles Walters called Weed Controls Without Poisons. And in that, he's very focused on how the weed is a manifestation of the soil conditions, essentially. And the dock, he says, is kind of describes how the soil conditions are kind of overly mineralized, and so the dock, very high in oxalic acid, is etching minerals out of the kind of mineralogical base in the soil. This is a piece of work I did years ago. This was, I drew oak trees for a summer when I had more time on my hands. And what's interesting when you just follow the process of a plant for a whole summer is you get an image in yourself of where that plant goes over time, what that plant does, what are the kind of rhythms of that plant, and what I sort of learned is that, in a way, what we meet as oak is kind of the wake of a process. It's the kind of cast off of a process, but actually there's a process that's oaking out there in the countryside every summer. So it's this kind of idea that there's a condition to life, and then there's the life that we meet. And so that really is where kind of biodynamics, I think, has kind of something to say, in that it begins to touch into this idea that life has a condition and a manifestation. And the question is, the research piece is, how do we get to the conditions? So just finally, this is one of our students, and I would say that kind of what biodynamics offers to the young person with autism is that you actually create around them a harmonious scenario which has plenty of entry points into it for them to engage with nature. And for somebody who lives in that state of disharmony, I think to meet a landscape that's kind of completely balanced or is working towards balance can in a way aid them, can kind of stimulate them in their own journey of development. Great, thank you.
I'm going to ask the audience a question that suddenly occurred to me during Ed's talk. Do we as a civilization suffer from collective autism? Are we unable to split up all of the information and do the right thing? Is part of our inability to act an autistic response to the information overload and the overwhelming amount of information? So that's a question to you. But please have some questions back for this wonderful panel. The others want to add. When I said it, it's from my personal journey. Much of the organic movement came out of the environmental movement, and we see the human being as a sinful species on the planet that's creating havoc. And when you move into the biodynamic sphere, it's more like this is our destiny. We are in this mess, and we need to find humanity, and it's really in our humanity that we should find the solutions, rather than look at extinction tables and forecasts and graphs and curves. This is something about the human being, and maybe creation put us here where we are right now to work our way out of this. So it's that perspective that made me say it.
Well, homeopathy is working when in another way than the preparations. But what is true with this picture is that it's in quantity. It's very, very few. Yes? It's not the quantity, it's the dynamic aspect of what the forces which are linked to this very few material thing which is prepared like this, yeah? And when we say it's like homeopathy for the earth, it takes up the picture that with very few material substance, you can have a very big effect, a dynamic effect. But it's not in the sense as homeopathy works that you heal something what has brought the disease, yes? This is not in this way, but it's in the way that you have some kind of relation between substance and forces, which is extremely on the side of the forces. But still you have substance.
Yes, what we're trying to do is not cure, is inducing a natural process that will be there. If you think, yes, perhaps we use very little cow horn, but when you start to dynamize 20 grams of composted manure, you have billions of microorganisms in a liter of that water. Once you spray the water onto the ground, those billions, they just do what they would do, start propagating and going and moving and helping the root system of the vines to do their job, really. So that's what we're trying to do, is little but often to induce a natural process that will be just there anyway. It's just a starter kit, say it that way, yeah? Maybe in this way you just getting more dynamically in what's happened. Yeah?
Okay. I think, well, the interesting thing is that area north of Cape Town is called the Swartland, which is the black soils. It's a very fertile area, but right where this particular farm was, it was this pure sand. I tried everything, and I think towards, after being there about 12 of the 15 years, I suddenly had this amazing experience where I found this little area of the farm, which I hadn't grazed for a couple of years, and it was a kind of, well, it gave me masses of steps and gave me the way forward, which was that there is a wild vetch, which is hard seeded, very small leaves, and that had grown up. And where that grows up, it then dies after forming seed, and it would fall down again and formed a mulch. And the biggest weed that we had on this farm was couch grass, or quickgrass, because it would go everywhere, and of course farmers tried to get rid of it. But there, where this mulch was, this couch grass would grow up through it, and after 2 or 3 years, with fantastic long, lush leaves. And what one normally does in the farming is you have this lovely vetch growing, and you graze it off. So what we discovered was that we had to have the willpower not to graze that vetch, or maybe once every 3rd or 4th year, but let it grow up, let it die, and that started this process of forming soil. And and we got large areas, so we actually went in with a combine harvester, and we were combining this vetch, and you couldn't just use the cultivated bought vetch, because when you had a bit of drought and died, your seed was gone. But with this hard-coated seed, only a proportion would germinate every time, so you had a seed bank. So that was a big revelation for me. And of course, I was doing all sorts of other things. I think you saw the picture of the chickens, so we had chickens moving across, we had a dairy herd, it wasn't fully biodynamic. We didn't achieve that. We were buying in bran to feed to our cows from a conventional farm. So we couldn't label it as organic, but we were selling yogurt into supermarkets in Cape Town and so on. Well, one can answer that on all different levels. If you want the kind of spiritual answer to that, I don't know if I should be talking like this, but there is a difference between the plants and the animals and the human being. And the human being has got consciousness, or we talk about having an ego, an individuality. And not everybody might agree with that, but the animals have rather group souls. So the cow has feelings and that like we do, but they're not actually individual animals in the same way. So it's a bit like plucking a hair out of your head. another one regrows. And so when you kill a cow, it is not the same as killing a human being. The reason I'm explaining this is that the manure, when we eat food, our feces is completely dead. Because we have this consciousness, we've extracted the forces out of it completely. So it's dead in the sense that you have feces with the same nutrients as a cow's feces might have. But a cow manure has got an ego force in it because it hasn't used it up. And the cow manure, therefore, has an amazing fertility for plants growing. And that is because that force is still in there. And that's why in a biodynamic farm, the cow is so central. Of course, the sheep and the other animals have their place, but the cow is particularly important.
Yeah, so just to say about the horns. So when a calf's born or a goat kid is born, for the first week or so, when you kind of rub their head there, you can just feel they've got a little horn bud. And if you disbud your cows or your goats or whatever, then that's the time you do it, because the horn bud has not yet fused onto the skull. And it's not. And in the second week, and by that time, usually the animal's eating a little bit of hay or grass as well. By that time, that's when the horn bud fuses. So once he starts to actually take up the kind of nutrition from the earth, that's the point where the horn bud fuses, and then actually it's incredibly challenged at that point by the fibrous nature, by the kind of forces in the plant, and so the horn itself creates a kind of inner mirror that kind of reverberates the forces back into the metabolism. Essentially, that's the picture. So if you look at a cow's a fairly dreamy animal. A cow sort of lives very, very deeply in itself. If you look at a deer, which is also a ruminant, a deer is a much, much more wakeful animal. And if you actually look at the form of the antler, it's a completely different thing to a horn. A horn is something that essentially holds in those forces. If you look at a deer, it's something that streams that out away from the head. And that's what gives the deer the wakefulness, because the deer is eating incredibly tough stuff. Its kind of metabolism is kind of working super strong and full of forces in that picture. So yeah, the horns are seen as a kind of reflective organ of the digestion, essentially.